being here and thank you for inviting me to come here once more. My name is Linda Polman. I'm a freelance journalist, meaning that I do not work for one paper or for one TV station. Basically, I work for anybody who's willing to pay me. So I work for Dutch newspapers, Dutch magazines, and increasingly so also for all sorts of foreign newspapers, like The Guardian in London or The Nation in the United States, and a few German newspapers. And most of the time I write about humanitarian aid, the large humanitarian aid operations that we all know from TV. You know, you have a refugee stream somewhere, or you have an earthquake somewhere, and then you see all these huge international humanitarian aid organizations moving in. I called my book The Crisis Caravan. I brought the American edition, The Crisis Caravan, because I actually see them moving around the world to one humanitarian hotspot and on to the other, as in a caravan, you know, a caravan of white Land Rovers with the UN logo on it. I saw one in Jerusalem today. I'm sure you see them every day. If you go to an earthquake zone or a refugee camp, you will see dozens of them traveling in these rows to do their business. Maybe I will tell you something about myself and about the reasons and the causes why I started to investigate this subject.
That's not common.
Sure.
We will have 50 minutes. That's
1-5 or 5-0?
No, 5-0.
Yeah.
And then we will open it to questions and answers. Okay?
Okay. Yeah. I think I will even make it shorter because I would encourage you to ask as many questions as possible and to engage in dialogue, as they say. So I will not keep you too long. Even this afternoon, yesterday this afternoon, I reread my own book after a long time. And I got shocked again. Very strangely shocked. But I had forgotten quite a few things about it. I forgot a lot of details, what I mentioned in the book. Details that I brought up in my research. And it is quite bad, actually. It's even worse than I remember. I realized also today, when people ask me, when did you, why do you research humanitarian aid, what caused it? I always go back to the year 1999 or the year 2000, when I lived in West Africa, in Sierra Leone and in Liberia. Those were countries that had been for a long time in a very cruel civil war. Maybe you remember them. The icons of that war were those poor people who had their limbs cut off by rebels. They even cut off the arms and the legs of babies, you know. It was a totally cruel and very horrifying war. And it was these amputees that actually caught the attention of the world in the end. And it was the attention of the world that brought the first peace negotiations under the auspicion of the United Nations between the Sierra Leonean government and the rebels. And as a sort of reward for successful peace negotiations, the United Nations was dangling a bag of money in front of the rebels and in front of the Sierra Leonean president's nose. If they would agree to sign a peace contract with each other, a huge amount of aid would be made available for Sierra Leone. By that time, I had already lived for almost 3 years in that country as a foreign correspondent for Dutch newspapers. And in those 3 years, I had seen all that suffering. And what I recall most about that time in Sierra Leone was the darkness. It was not only the darkness, literally, you know, no electricity, because the country had run out of gasoline, so they could not start up their generators anymore. So we lived by candlelight and by oil lamps, which was quite depressing after a long time. But also the darkness in people's minds. The civil war had lasted for 11 years. Like I said, it was a really cruel civil war. And people's minds had switched off, you know, there was no joy anymore. There was also no news anymore because people did not have TVs and they had no batteries for their radios. So very occasionally we would get a report from BBC World on the radio, but otherwise there was just darkness in that country. And then we heard that in 1,000 kilometers away, we heard about those peace negotiations that were taking place. And then we heard that the peace contract was signed, and then from one day to the other, this crisis caravan moved into Sierra Leone, into Freetown, which was the capital of Sierra Leone. And almost from one moment to the other, the whole atmosphere there changed. All in all, I remember there were about 100 foreign aid organizations that moved in a very short period of time. And suddenly the lights went on in the capital because those aid organizations had brought gasoline and they brought generators. So lights were switched on. And then you saw a dramatic change in, for example, restaurants opened up again because all those foreigners that came into Sierra Leone, they wanted to eat in the night, they wanted to enjoy themselves. So the restaurants came back to life, the discotheques came back to life. The golf club came back to life. So you saw all these changes and it gave people hope in the beginning. It gave me hope in the beginning. We all thought things were going to change, but actually they didn't. What I saw happen was that the aid organizations, all those foreigners who had never been to Sierra Leone before, they were looking for local partners to work with and to negotiate with. And they ended up talking and negotiating with the Sierra Leone political elite. And those were the people that I knew from the war, and the political elite had kept the war going because the peace contract wasn't good enough for them, so they caused a lot of victims. They also talked to the local Arab elite, which was the business elite in Sierra Leone. Those were the ones that made a living during the war out of the arms trade and out of blood diamonds. And then after the war, they made their living out of delivering stuff for the NGOs. The NGOs needed office space, they needed cars, they needed food, they needed supplies. And the Arab business elite was supplying that for them. So that was the second party of bad guys that actually profited from the aid. And then the third thing that really shocked me was that the NGOs, they preferred aid projects for the rebels in Sierra Leone. Those were the ones that had been cutting off the limbs. It was not the ordinary Sierra Leoneans who were profiting from the aid, it was the rebels who were given preference in the dividing of the aid projects. So I saw these political swines and the business bad guys and the rebels, they were doing fine with the aid. And I didn't understand that. I thought aid was there, humanitarian aid was there to help the poor and the innocent. And in Sierra Leone, I realized that it didn't work like that, this aid thing. So in my own recollection until this afternoon, I thought that was the starting point for me to start working on research about this humanitarian aid caravan. But this afternoon I realized that my experience with humanitarian aid went back about 5 or 6 years earlier. That was in what was then still called Zaire, 1994. The genocide in Rwanda. I went to Rwanda after the genocide in 1995. Maybe most of you are too young to remember what happened. But 1994, suddenly, for us in the West, suddenly this civil war broke out in Rwanda. Two groups of people, the Hutus and the Tutsis. The Hutus started to kill off the Tutsis in a very short period of time. In about 3 months, they managed to kill almost 1 million people there. There was very, very few Western people inside Rwanda when this happened, because as soon as the violence broke out, Westerners left. The few aid organizations that were there, they left because of the violence. The few journalists that were there, they left because of the violence. So the only thing that we saw in the West from this genocide that was happening inside Rwanda was actually what came out of Rwanda. People fled the country, they came over the hills, and those were almost biblical pictures that we got on TV. people fleeing over the hills of Rwanda, and they streamed down the hills into Zaire, the place which is now called Congo. There were more than 2 million people who fled the country, and it was a really sad and quite spectacular sight, because those people were actually running out of the country, you know, they were on mopeds and they were on bicycles, and they were carrying their children and their mattresses on their heads, and they all fled over the mountains, and they descended down in a place called Goma, and there they just sat, and then it started to rain, and these people just sat there waiting for somebody to do something for them. Eight organizations came, but they came too late to stop an enormous cholera epidemic. Within a very short period of time, 15,000 people died of cholera. So it was a total disaster that we got to see on television. But our whole perception of what we were actually seeing was totally wrong. It was the most misunderstood humanitarian disaster in history. What we saw fleeing over the mountains and dying of cholera were not the people who had survived the genocide. It was the people who had actually perpetrated the genocide. It was not Tutsis, it were the Hutus who fled the country. They were driven out of the country by a Tutsi army that had invaded from Uganda, and they were pushed out of the country. So it was actually the genocide, it was actually the killers that descended in Goma. It was actually the killers that got the humanitarian aid operation. And it was a huge humanitarian aid operation. The people were so shocked about what they were seeing on television that millions of dollars were pouring in. There were more than 100 aid organizations inside the camps for the Hutu killers. And they were handing out that aid. And when I was there in 1995, the camps had been there for 1 year. And they were huge, you know, all these people, the camps had developed into a sort of city. People were still living in plastic tents, but everything else was developed, you know. There were butchers and there were cinemas and there were the entire university of Rwanda that had moved to the camps in Goma. There were doctors, there were hospitals, there were clinics that were brought in by the international aid organizations. Life was not so bad inside those camps. And when you looked closely, you could actually see the killers, the genocidaires as they were called over there. You could actually see them amongst the refugees. They were still wearing their uniforms. They were still wearing the machetes that they had used to kill their compatriots. You could see tanks parked in between the tents. You could see fight helicopters parked in between the tents. But all those aid organizations were just pouring aid into that camp. The camp was totally in the hands of the genocidaires. They were the ones who were telling the aid organizations who could eat and who could not eat. They were the ones taxing the humanitarian aid organizations. In hindsight, the aid organizations estimate that about 40% of all the millions that were poured into that camp were actually stolen by the Hutu military and the Hutu militia, and they used that money to rearm themselves and to continue their genocide inside Rwanda. So this was a total ethical disaster, you could say. So I realized only this afternoon that this is actually when my whole thinking about humanitarian aid was quite disturbed, 1994, 1995, in that area. There are similarities between Sierra Leone and Rwanda. It is the same aid organizations that moved in, and it is the same principle according to which they work. I discovered that they are actually a sort of industry, an aid industry. Let me paint you a picture of that industry. You have, on this planet, you have about 70 or 80 donor governments. My country is a donor government. Germany is, but the really big donor governments are the United States. They are the biggest on earth. They spend most money on aid of all countries. The second biggest is the European Union. The third biggest is the United Kingdom, and then you get 76 smaller governments. All these governments combined, they make available per year $130 billion for aid. This is development aid in general, and it is humanitarian aid specifically. The 130 billion will be more in years when there are large disasters. Like now for Syria, there's more money available. But if there is an earthquake in Haiti, several billions will be added to that amount of money. So that's the donor, the official donor government money, $130 billion per year. On top of that, there's all the billions of dollars that private people like me, like you, we take it out of our pockets, whenever there's a fundraiser on television, for example. You take money out of your pocket and you support your favorite aid organization. That adds billions of dollars more to the $130 there. Nobody knows how much money that is, that private money, because there's no central registration. There's no central place where aid organizations have to go and confess how much money they are spending and where they are spending it and how they are spending it. Aid is a free market. Today, tonight, we could, with all of us, we could decide to become an NGO. The only thing we need is money. So give me money and give me a ticket. And tonight I can be in Syria and be an NGO there. Nobody will stop me, nobody will ask me questions. I don't need licenses, I don't need a diploma. Anybody can become an NGO. So nobody knows how many NGOs there actually are. The United Nations once made an effort to count, or at least to try and count how many NGOs there are, and they stopped counting at 37,000. There are much more of them. The most recent estimate that I got was about 50,000 NGOs. And those are
humanitarian aid NGOs or
both, yeah. And those are NGOs that work internationally. Those are NGOs that work outside their own country. So it's not the local Salvation Army, it's international working organizations. So say 50,000 NGOs. So you have these 80 donor governments, you have 50,000 NGOs, and you have this huge pot of money, $130 billion plus. You can imagine that wherever there is so much money involved, wherever there are so many parties involved, you can imagine that a very lively market develops. These 50,000 NGOs, they all want a part of that donor money, a part of the money that we donate. So those aid organizations are in competition with each other for our money, for our attention, for the attention of the donor governments. So this competition has a lot of consequences. It means that aid organizations will not necessarily choose to work with the poorest people and with the most desperate people. These aid organizations will work in places for people that donors choose. The donors, less than 25% of all aid money is actually spent on the poorest and on the most desperate people on this planet. 75% of the aid money goes to countries where donors have a political or military interest. So the vast majority, the vast mass of aid money actually goes to countries that the West considers partners in the war against terror. The largest aid recipients are countries like Ethiopia, like Somalia, like Iraq, like the Palestinian territories. These are all considered military and politically interesting places. What is left will go to the poorest people. So this is where NGOs go. If the donor money goes somewhere, then the NGOs will go there too. So this paints an entirely different picture of how humanitarian the aid industry actually is. If you know the basic principles of humanitarianism, that is that they are shrined in the Geneva Conventions, is that aid must always be independent. It must always be impartial. Meaning that you cannot bring money or goods into a war and then only one party make profit of that aid. If you want to be a humanitarian, you have to aid everybody. Let me take you back to where humanitarianism started. I'm sure you are all familiar with the name of Henri Dunant, and you are perhaps also familiar with the name Florence Nightingale. These were the two most famous and most important humanitarians that have ever existed. And they existed in the same period of time. They actually knew each other, but they contradicted each other totally. The problem they had with each other is the problem that still exists today. Henri Dunant went to a war. I will not bother you with the details of that war, but a lot of soldiers in that war were killed, and a lot of soldiers were wounded, and they were left in the field to die. And Henri Dunant was there. He was a businessman traveling in the area, and he happened to be a witness to this battle. And he saw 40,000 soldiers die in the mud and in the blood, and he decided that it was his Christian duty to help those soldiers. So he gathered money, he did a fundraiser, and he gathered volunteers to help, and they carried all those wounded soldiers off the fields, and they made clinics, they improvised clinics, and he cared for those soldiers. And he was so impressed with himself that when he came back home, he was a Swiss person, he lived in Geneva. When he came home, he decided to lobby to make it into a professional aid organization. And that was to become the International Committee of the Red Cross. That was the very first humanitarian aid organization. The basic principle of this humanitarian aid, the ICRC, the Red Cross, is that Henri Dunant helped all of those soldiers. He never asked the nationality of that soldier. He never asked questions. He never asked why they were wounded. How did it happen? For which cause were you fighting? He didn't care. The only thing he saw was blood, and he decided to put a band-aid on that. So he said humanitarianism is not asking any questions. You help whoever is in need. Around that same time, Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp, she went to another war. And she was also helping wounded soldiers. But she came to totally different conclusions. She said you have to ask questions. She realized that she was fixing up these soldiers that were wounded, British soldiers, and she realized that after she had fixed them up, they were sent back to the front, and they were sent back to fight again. And she realized that she was setting up this wonderful taking care of soldiers system for the British Army, and she realized that the British Minister of War was taking a profit out of that. It made it easier for the British Minister of War to recruit new soldiers, for example, because he could say, come to fight for me. If you get wounded, then you can go to this wonderful clinic set up by Florence Nightingale. So it was easier for him to find new soldiers. He was also saving money, because if a soldier got wounded and was sent home, as the minister, he was obliged to pay them a pension for wounded. But if Florence Nightingale fixed them up, he saved all this money out of the pensions of those soldiers. So he was saving a lot of money, and he was also having a good public relations advantage, thanks to Florence Nightingale. And she couldn't live with that. She said, what is important, she said, is to make, you should not make a war easier for a minister. You should not make a war cheaper for a minister. You should make it as expensive as possible. Because every penny that he has to spend on the wounded, every penny that he has to spend on a clinic, he cannot spend on weapons. So we as civilians, we should not help these ministers to have their wars. Her responsibility was to point at who was responsible for those soldiers dying. And this is what she did for the rest of her life. She only went to one war. She did what she had to do there. She went back to England, and the rest of her life she spent pointing at the responsible people and saying, you are responsible for these people being wounded, so you pay for them. So when she heard of Henri Dunant, that he was actually establishing the International Red Cross, making it easier for people to have wars, she thought it was a totally ridiculous idea. She was very much against it. This hurt the feelings of Henri Dunant because he was a great admirer of Florence Nightingale. He tried to convince her that it was important to be humanitarian, to not ask questions, to help whoever was in need. But Florence Nightingale could not be convinced, and she did not want to be involved with the International Red Cross. So their ways separated. Henri Dunant won. The International Red Cross came, and the humanitarian principle that he invented, ask no questions, bring aid to whoever needs aid, that is the humanitarian principle still in place today. humanitarian aid organizations do not ask questions. If their aid is being abused, like I described in the camps in Goma, if there's Hutu killers abusing the aid, if there's Hutu killers stealing the aid, selling it and buying weapons with the profits, humanitarian aid organizations don't ask questions. They think it's part of the job. They say it's not our responsibility, it's politics that should intervene here, it's not us that should intervene here, we have no responsibility. Our only responsibility is to take care of the sick and to take care of the wounded. It's not our responsibility to ask who those wounded are and why they are wounded. That is something that politics should do. So you have these two streams in humanitarianism, ask questions or don't ask questions. I obviously am for the Florence Nightingale approach. I think that Henri Dunant only works well in a place where everybody is holy, where nobody is abusing aid, where soldiers fight with their fists. You know, I put you knock out, and then Henri Dunant will come and he will plaster you. But we live in a world where wars are very, very dirty. If you look at the war in Syria, if you look at the war in Rwanda, if you look at the wars in Darfur, there are genocides taking place. It is targets. Most people that die in wars these days are civilians. It's not military at all. 90% of all the war casualties are civilians, including children. You know, these are very, very dirty wars. And if you come there with your millions of dollars of aid money, it is your duty to ask questions. That's what I think. If there's a chance that your aid is abused, if there's a chance that your aid will be used against the victims, like in Goma, like in Sierra Leone, where the wrong people were profiting from the aid and the right people were not profiting from the aid, if that situation is there, I think it is your duty as an aid organization to ask questions and to make sure that your aid doesn't hurt more people, that it actually helps more people. Unfortunately, they're not listening. I did my best, but they're still at it. In the 90s and up till now, I visited many, many, many different humanitarian aid operations. I went to Haiti after the earthquake, and to Darfur, and to Afghanistan, and to Congo, and to more places in West Africa. You see the same thing repeating itself over and over again. Aid is given with a political interest or with a military interest, and it is received with a military interest. The aid in Afghanistan is a very strong example. It is the aid in Afghanistan is given with our political interest. We want to defeat the Taliban there. And the aid is also received with a political interest. It is received as a weapon of war. The Taliban will do anything that they can to get hold of as much of the aid as they can and to use it against us and against their own people. So the aid is given in the same spirit as it is received. And the same mechanism is in most wars that you see these days. It is given as our military weapon, and it is received as a military weapon. The estimate is that more than half of all the aid money that we spend, so we are talking about these billions, more than half of that aid money is actually disappearing. And we have to presume that in an area where the Taliban is master, disappeared aid is in the hands of the Taliban because they are the boss there. We have to presume that in an area where the regime of Sudan is in charge, that the aid will disappear into their war chest, and we have to presume that in a place like Sierra Leone or in a place like Liberia, the aid is disappearing into the pockets of Liberian rebels if they are in charge somewhere. Aid organizations, this is final thing I will say before I will engage in conversation with you. Aid organizations have this problem when they work. Well, they have many problems, but a very important problem is a phenomenon called humanitarian negotiations. negotiations for access into a certain war zone. Aid organizations can never just march into a country. They will always come up against a local government or a local chief or a local rebel leader or a local general or a local whatever. There will always be somebody in a certain territory who is the boss. An aid organization that wants to enter a certain area, they want to enter a refugee camp, for example, or they want to enter a place where there's a famine area, for example, they will always have to negotiate their access into that country. I myself, as a journalist, did that often. I was, for example, traveling in a rebel area in Africa, and there would always be roadblocks where I would be stopped, you know. And there would always be rebels there demanding money or demanding a school pen or demanding bread. So I was in the habit of carrying a lot of bread with me so I could feed the rebels to allow me access there. But if you are the World Food Programme, or if you are UNICEF, or if you are the UNHCR, which are billion-dollar organizations, you cannot get away with a school pen for a rebel. You will be paying a percentage of the aid that you are bringing in. In some areas in Somalia, the percentage of the aid that you actually pay as a sort of excess fee can run up to 80% of what you bring in. And in other places, it will be running up to 30 or 40% of what you bring in. It is a well-kept secret inside the humanitarian aid world, because obviously aid organizations do not volunteer this information, because we will be so disgusted that we will stop giving our money. So this is humanitarian negotiations to get access to victims. So there are a lot of questions that you can ask about how I mean, should you stay in an area, should you go to an area if a certain percentage of your aid will actually be paid to warlords? And if you decide, look, we are not living in the perfect world, we cannot get out of paying a certain amount to get access to victims, what should be the limit of what you pay? Is it 5%? Is it 10%? Is it 80%? But you should have a sort of common agreement. But what happens now is that all these 50,000 aid organizations, they all have the freedom to make their own negotiations. Nobody will stop them. They work separately from each other. We read in the newspaper that aid has arrived somewhere. What actually happens is that 100 or 1,000 aid organizations in Haiti after the earthquake, more than 10,000 aid organizations came. We're talking about serious numbers here, and they were bringing $5 billion. So you're talking about serious numbers here. So these aid organizations do not call each other, they don't telephone each other before they travel to Somalia, before they travel to Sudan or to Syria. They will make their own decision. They will go there, they will negotiate with any local authority that they need permission to get access from. And they will make their own deal with that local authority. So that means that we don't know how much of the money is actually being paid as an access fee. And humanitarian aid organizations will not tell us this because they're afraid that we will be disgusted. So what is the answer? In my opinion, it is very important for aid organizations to stop working as separate businesses, to stop working in competition with each other. I think it is very important for aid organizations to combine their efforts, to take responsibility, to go into Syria or to go into Sudan as one, as a force, and sort of say, look, we have $1 billion to spend here in the coming year. We are with 108 organizations, together we are a force to reckon with. Don't mess with us, you know. We are combined. It's like the Three Musketeers, you know, all for one and one for all. If you touch that organization, if you try to blackmail that organization into paying access fee, then we will all leave. You know? So you can combine your effort, you can combine your money. But aid organizations don't do this because they are in competition with each other. And nobody can stop them from being in competition with each other because it's a free market. I think it went totally in a wrong direction. what I see as the most dangerous thing is that after 50 or 60 years of humanitarian aid, it took a big flight after the Second World War. So 50, 60, perhaps even longer humanitarian aid, the receiving end of humanitarian aid, the people there, the leaders there, the warlords there, they have learned the mechanisms of the humanitarian aid industry. They have learned how they operate. They have learned that they are in competition with each other. They have learned that they can actually manipulate those aid organizations by playing on the competition. If one aid organization says no to a project, another aid organization will say yes because they are in competition with each other. So the recipient end has learned to use the mechanisms of the aid industry, and I think this is a really dangerous development. One of the things that I noticed already quite some time ago is that the recipient end, the African rebels, for example, they have learned how to trigger humanitarian aid. They have learned that aid organizations will only come if there is money flowing into that direction. How do you start money flowing? By getting media attention. So how do you get media attention? By triggering me, I want to see dead bodies, and I want to see more dead bodies than I saw in the war before. So victims are being created to attract the attention of the media. Victims are being created to attract the attention of the donors. And this is all done to attract the aid organizations and the money. So the recipient end, having found out how the humanitarian aid industry works, is a very dangerous development. I hope you have questions for me, or yes, please.
Listening to what you described, it seems to me that the main problem is where the humanitarian aid comes to war zones between tribes and ethnic parties. Is there a place to separate between the humanitarian aids to war zones and to climate places like earthquakes and tsunamis, where there seems to be no problem because everyone there is really hurt and there's no one there to gain profit from it? Is there a place to make such a separation?
Also in places where there are large earthquakes, even in places where there's no war, you will still find the competition of interests. I mean, you are talking about a lot of places like Haiti, for example.
But that's for the good, because all the money goes to people who really need it, and you're not playing into the hands of warlords that kill more. It's not like anybody's gonna make another earthquake to get more money.
No, this is true. Although in Haiti, Haiti as an example, in Haiti you cannot create another earthquake, but in Haiti you can create your own aid market. Of those aid organizations that came from the earthquake, many of them will stay there forever and ever because they've created their market there. They've created their poverty market. But another thing is that I think you will only not encounter this problem if you take aid to a rich country. Like for example in Japan after the what was it, the tsunami or an earthquake. That was a country that took control of the aid that was offered in an international way. That was a country that said this and this and this we need and the rest we will not allow in. So you don't create the problem if you go with your aid to a rich country. But aid organizations tend to go to poor countries. This is where they have free access. This is where donors have their military and political interest. This is where the aid flows go. So in the ideal world, because you said you can make a separation between countries at war and countries that are not at war, that would be a start of organizing the aid industry a little bit. But then you touch on the basic problem of the aid industry, and that is that it is a free market. There is no regulation for aid. The only thing that is there is money. As long as the money is available, nobody can stop aid organizations. You know what I mean? So.
But I'm asking on myself. If I'm a donor and I want to give, I want to help people that need my money because they were harmed in ways that were out of their control. But I don't want my money to go to warlords. If I donate especially to places that were hurt only by earthquakes or tsunamis or hurricanes or whatever, is there at least some guarantee that my money goes to good deeds and not to the wrong hands?
I'm afraid not, because it's horrible. But, you see, because we cannot check what is happening with aid money as soon as it leaves our own country. You have to try to imagine an aid organization like Oxfam, for example, which is one of the 10 largest ones. They work with almost 1,000 local organizations. It is not Oxfam that goes there with a shovel and with people to dig latrines or to build refugee camps or to build bridges or whatever. Oxfam collects the money and then they divide it over all those local partner organizations. Oxfam will tell us that they're actually checking who those local organizations are and how they are spending the money, but Oxfam cannot check that. In my research as a journalist, if I wanted to investigate how a certain aid organization was working, that means that I would have to travel to Africa, find their dozens of local partner organizations, hire a moped, go to find those dozens of local organizations, find the projects, check what is happening to the projects, come back after a year and check how the project is doing then. So the investigation into that and the checking of how the money is actually being spent is impossible. Yeah, and this is a very bad thing, because the majority of the money of our Western aid money goes to countries in war. It is because we think it is important to have the right people in the right places. We think it is important to have allies in the war against terror. So most of our aid money goes to countries in war. And you can be a good donor, but you lose against all the bad donors. Yeah. So, yeah.
Hi. Regarding what you just answered to Faith, you criticize the aid organizations by saying that they have no regulations and they can't be stopped because no one is regulating their activity. My question is, the goal of your book is to try and do what? To stop the organizations from donating to causes that you see unfit, or to raise awareness, for example, for people that are donating money to see what is being done?
Yeah, I think it all starts with knowledge. I think it all starts with the awareness. You have to realize how the aid industry works. You have to realize that there is an aid industry. The majority of us realize very little about aid. We see a starving African child on TV, and we see a white person saying, "Give me money and I will rescue this child for you." That is about the extent of knowledge that we have about aid. So it was my intention to raise awareness amongst the public. Aid organizations know this. I'm not telling them anything new, or I shouldn't be telling them anything new, let's put it that way. But the aid organizations themselves, after every aid operation, a significant aid operation, they bring in the think tanks and they bring in the researchers and they produce piles and piles and piles of evaluations, which are used gratefully for the research of the book. Aid organizations know exactly where the weak points are in their programs and in their industry. And after every humanitarian aid organization, operation, they promise that next time that they'll do better. And they never do, because the system in itself doesn't change.
So that's a form of regulation in your eyes, if I understand correctly. So my question is, do you support regulation in stopping them, or just raising awareness? So
well, yeah, I would like to ban all of them and have the International Red Cross, and that's it. At least then you know what's happening. But I'm being very naive here. This is not going to happen. And then, as soon as the International Red Cross would be the only one, they would be corrupt and they would become a world government. So it would be impossible. What I want is for aid organizations to make it a topic again, to discuss with each other how they can improve the way that they operate. I have to give credits to Médecins Sans Frontières. I criticize them heavily in this book but they're also one of the more interesting aid organizations because they are very willing to be critical about themselves. They have a very large research department, for example, not researching where you can find new customers, but research into how their own mechanisms work. Médecins Sans Frontières produced a book already 3 years ago, I think. It's called Humanitarian Negotiations Review, in which they evaluate the moral dilemmas they came across, the places where their aid was being stolen and abused, the decisions that their organizations made at the time. Sometimes they stayed, sometimes they left, and they evaluated why they did what they did, and they try to think about how to do it better the next time. It was an invitation to other. Médecins Sans Frontières sounds like a small organization, but it is one of the 10 biggest on the planet. They invited, the book was meant to invite the other big aid organizations to do the same thing, to engage in this conversation, to engage in this evaluation of their own moral dilemmas and their own moral choices. After the book was produced, there was a deafening silence. Not one aid organization even acknowledged the fact that the book had been published. So this for me is a sign, the next sign, that it will be very difficult for aid organizations, the aid industry, to change themselves. They have to be helped to change. And I believe that is where our power is, not journalists, but our power in general. Aid organizations, in the end, they work with our money. It is either the tax money that we pay, or it is the money that we take out of our pocket. So I think that the big stimulants of change will have to come from the public.
Are there any advantage to use medicinal food instead of money itself? When an NGO comes to an area, if you use medicine or if you use food, maybe it will end the 80% or 40 or 50% of the money that went to the local chief or the local.
Yeah, well, it's not up to aid organizations what aid to bring. It's up to the donors what aid to bring. An aid organization can ask for money, but they will get food. The most aid that is given on this planet is food aid. And that is not, I don't want to be cynical, but I am cynical. That's not because we pity people that are hungry, it's because we have huge leftover produce of aid, of food. So 70% of all aid given is food, and then an aid organization can jump up and down, but food is what they will get to hand out to people. So it's not up to them. But obviously there